think the Overton window has shifted in crypto on decentralization. So decentralization is a continuum. For the first sort of era of crypto, we used to think it was you are decentralized or you're not, but there are degrees of it. And we're actually just getting to the point where the kind of line of decentralization is being negotiated. Is this a decentralized network or not? And I do think the likes of Tempo, who for me have kind of crossed the line into this permissioned validator set, which we used to call proof of authority chains, that was a kind of previous red line. And we've moved into an era where we are letting go of our previous paradigm of decentralization. And that's putting a kind of selective pressure across the rest of the industry.
This episode is brought to you by Nexo. Step into a new era of digital wealth. Earn interest on your digital assets, borrow against them without selling, and trade all in one platform. Get started at nexo.com/breakdown. Nothing said on The Breakdown is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and any views expressed by anyone on the show are opinions, not financial advice. Hosts and guests may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Welcome everybody to The Breakdown. I'm your host, David Canellis, and with me is Nick Almond, the head of governance for Jito Foundation. How's it going?
Very good. Thank you, David.
That's good. You've heard me ramble on about, this idea of what the most used chain might be for the past 15 minutes, I guess. What did I get wrong? What did I get right? What do you think?
I thought you were largely over the target, actually. I think you were right to kind of critically analyze the way in which we're evaluating these chains. I think the kind of argument around pulling out how Bitcoin is different. Bitcoin's valued most in the market, and yet it effectively is like close to zero on revenue in the classic sense. So the metrics that we're using to measure blockchains, things like daily active users, all of these things like need to be revisited in this kind of new paradigm of value, if you like.
We did catch up, before we kind of had this chat just now. And, something that came up was that, Solana is really kind of headed where the market wants it to go. And in some sense, Ethereum and under Vitalik's leadership, that isn't so much of a concern. And instead, they're kind of looking at Ethereum would kind of play for what, society, they think society needs in a few decades in these kind of really hyper decentralized networks for more, public good use cases rather than high frequency trading and stuff like that. How long do you think it will take for the market to kind of realize that it does have control over what these networks are doing, kind of in terms of a business development sense and their trajectories?
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing this potentially like a bifurcation between the end game for these different networks. I think you're right there to frame the Ethereum goal, which is much more cypherpunk, right? So it's much more about building a hyper-resilient network that will be here in 100 years. Vitalik is a long-termist. The roadmap spans, decades, really. So it moves slower and it optimizes for resilience and decentralization. But the trade-off of that is it's not going to move to where the market is quite as quickly as, say, Solana is directly doing. So I think that there's trade-offs to both of these dynamics. And at the moment, the market values decentralization very highly. The kind of top two most decentralized networks, if you like, being Bitcoin and Ethereum, are top two in the market. So it's clear that kind of resilience, long-term Lindy effect kind of system is valued in the market. However, I do think there's going to be a huge amount of value to moving where the market is to facilitate things like high frequency trading, sort of low latency execution, high quality execution. Those are trade-offs that Vitalik and Ethereum at large don't really want to make, because that will kill home stakers and it will reduce decentralization on the network to a point where I don't think Vitalik finds tolerable.
On a long enough timeline, it does kind of feel like Solana will eventually be faced with a very similar conundrum as what Ethereum is facing, in that, Solana is, working through this process of reducing token emissions to reduce the subsidies for validators, which has made it somewhat less attractive to run a validator for some of the existing participants on the network. And that can only go on for so long, because those token emissions are valued based on the price of Sol. And if we enter a world where the price of Sol goes up dramatically from here, then all of a sudden it doesn't matter that the token emissions have been pulled back. And at that point, it would become more attractive to invest in the high computing power, bandwidth, and all that sort of thing that you need to run a validator. So that kind of feels like that both Solana and Ethereum, while they're on the same side, they're not exactly competing for the same end goal. But at the same time, Ethereum is valued much higher than Solana, at least presently. So it's like you kind of touched on the lindiness of it all. Like, how much should we look at the difference in valuation of, say, Ethereum and Solana through the lens of, well, the market does value decentralization, and that's why Ethereum is worth more? Or is it a Lindy thing? Like, how do you square these two kind of aspects of it? Step into a new era of digital wealth with Nexo, the premier digital assets wealth platform. Earn interest on your digital assets, borrow against them without selling, trade a wide range of cryptocurrencies, all in one place. Nexo is now available again in the US with an evolved product suite tailored to today's market. For a limited time, new US clients can unlock 30 days of exclusive Wealth Club Premier benefits, including enhanced interest rates, reduced borrowing costs, and up to 0.5% crypto cashback on trades. Get started today at nexo.com/breakdown. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions apply. Do your own research.
We're looking for new valuation paradigms that are more sort of rooted in crypto economics than your sort of traditional equities like valuation. And that includes things like time in the market, Lindy effect. It also includes, actual usage of the networks. It includes monetary policy. I think a lot of it is about trust. Right, so time in the market is huge in crypto. If you can be very convinced that this network's going to be around in 5-10 years, you're more likely to be able to hold significant value on these networks. So I think Lindy effect is big, but I also think we're moving into a sort of era where, as Blockworks frames it, actually like real economic value. What is the value that is flowing through these chains? And we're starting to see the institutionalization of these networks. We're starting to see ETFs come online. Like the staking ETFs, like GTOSOL has an ETF coming in soon. So we're going to start to be able to look at inflows through things like inflows and outflows through ETFs as value flowing into the network. And we're going to be able to sort of analyze these things in a way that is different to the way in which networks are valued, or rather like traditional companies are valued. So it's a kaleidoscope of different data points, really. And we're starting to see the impact of there's things like marketing and narrative and broad scale adoption and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think we've yet to really land what the valuation paradigm is for blockchains. And that's still currently being negotiated, I think. But one thing is true is that I think we're entering into a new era where we are going to head into more sort of realism around decentralization. So kind of radical decentralization is becoming less preferred in the market as the regulatory context changes. And more realistic approaches to what does the market want and who are the personas, if you like, of the kind of people that we want to come in and start adopting crypto. And I think it's going to be possibly a network like Solana that can go to the market and be actively modifying its blockchain to deal with these things. And it is a more responsive and there is a direct desire to modify the network frequently to modify to the network context, to the market context.
I can only see this really ending where, that there are, say, a handful of blockchains that really do prioritize decentralization. And that is obviously a scale because Solana is prioritizing decentralization compared to something like Tempo with its permission validator set. But at the same time, Ethereum is also to the left of Solana on that scale as well. But at some point, it will become important that we just measure the usage of each individual chain, perhaps with custom parameters for each network, because, real economic value does make sense for a blockchain that its primary use case is either payments or settlement for trading and stuff like that. But if there is a quote unquote public good network that handles very important processes for society in some future network state, but it's not a lot of economic value that's flowing through those chains. It's more a settlement system for smart contract actions in kind of critical worldwide context, like insurance payouts or something like that. I just don't see how this squares with the hyper financialization of crypto, where we do want these metrics to understand the valuations of things, but public goods are almost priceless in a way. And at least that is what the idealistic view of like what Vitalik and kind of the solar punk people want.
Yes.
So how do we get through that without, devaluing the need for decentralized systems for public goods?
So I think the Overton window has shifted in crypto on decentralization. So decentralization is a continuum. For the first sort of era of crypto, we used to think it was you are decentralized or you're not. But there are degrees of it. And we're actually just getting to the point where the kind of line of decentralization is being negotiated. Is this a decentralized network or not? And I do think the likes of Tempo, who've kind of crossed the line into this permission validator set, which we used to call proof of authority chains. That was a kind of previous red line. And we've kind of moved into an era where we are letting go of our previous paradigm of decentralization. And that's putting a kind of selective pressure across the rest of the industry. So, yeah, we've got this kind of continuum of decentralization. You've got Bitcoin at the most radical end of decentralization. And with that becomes its rigidity and low transaction speeds. And Ethereum is much more closer to that. It's like, for me, in my mind, it's a kind of Bitcoin adjacent network. And I think that's its general trajectory, is that it's going to be a kind of Bitcoin with smart contracts and it's programmable money. But it's got the same philosophy of hyper resilience and Vitalik's new angle of it's about simplicity and code minimization. And it's trying to become a kind of base layer public good like execution environment. Ready for a world where, things get incredibly hostile for crypto. And I think philosophically, we have a lot of other networks who are moving in a kind of slightly different direction, that have much smaller validator sets. They're much more centralized and they're optimizing for pace and institutionalization. And actually, Solana is not one of those kind of very centralized chains. Certainly, much more decentralized than the likes of Tempo and many of the other sort of up and coming networks. So yeah, it will have this kind of choice around where does the validator set live, what's the optimal validator set. And I do think we're likely to see a further contraction of the validator set in Solana as the requirements, we're pushing towards this kind of notion of IBRL, increasing bandwidth, reducing latency. And necessarily that's going to push the frontier of hardware. So that's going to up the requirements further on validators. It's going to get more technical. The likes of Jito's BAM is like, it's using trustless execution environments, that the hardware is changing. And that's the kind of optimization frontier for the likes of Solana. It's pushing both hardware and effectively trying to run at the kind of boundary of physics and hardware on one side, and willing to find a kind of optimization around decentralization. It is still very, very decentralized. And, it's a matter of what is the necessary level of, what is the realistic and necessary level of decentralization that achieves a network goal, but continues to stay resilient to like 99.9% of attacks. I think Ethereum is it's planning for the apocalypse, a bit like Bitcoin is. And I think Solana is a bit more, let's go and synthesize with the traditional finance world and see where we end up.
Let's take a moment to talk about Nexo. Nexo delivers a premier digital assets wealth platform designed to help clients build, manage, and preserve their wealth, earn interest on your digital assets, access crypto-backed credit without selling your holdings, trade with advanced tools, all supported by 24/7 client care. Now back in the US, Nexo offers new clients 30 days of exclusive Wealth Club Premier access. That means enhanced interest rates, reduced borrowing costs, and up to 0.5% crypto cashback on trades. Benefits typically reserved for Wealth Club members and private clients. Nexo is also expanding its global presence, becoming the official crypto partner of Tennis Australia, the organisation behind the Australian Open, and the digital asset partner of the Audi Revolut Formula One team. If you're ready to approach digital assets with a more structured wealth strategy, visit nexo.com/breakdown to get started. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions apply. Do your own research. This is like philosophically like the one thing that I always get stuck on in terms of like being a decentralization maxi. It's like the instances where most of us in, the Western world, we don't really have a dire need for decentralized money networks. Like, it doesn't come up that much for me and you. So that's why it's so easy to use centralized stable coins. It's easy to just wire USDC to Kraken and then off ramp to our bank. It doesn't really come up. And, there's so few instances where these networks are legitimately tested for their decentralization. So that's why it comes down to like, well, what's the validator count? And if the validator count is reducing, then it must be less decentralized. And historically for Ethereum, it has had those moments with the DAO rollback, or whatever you want to call it, hard fork in 2016. But that was an incredibly long time ago, so it's not even worth bringing up anymore. And it kind of comes up with Solana here and there when there's network downtime, or like whatever you want to call that downtime. But, it happened with BNB chain when they needed to roll back, and CZ was talking about rolling back, Bitcoin even when there was some hack going on as well. And that's not possible. So it seems like that at some point, whether it's Tempo or another permissioned validator set chain that is used for payments, that maybe rollbacks on those networks would become very familiar for users. And at that point, would we even say that that's a bad thing? Because we do have these other decentralized networks that you can transact on, and the cost of doing business on these regulated chain rails is that, maybe your transaction might be rolled back, or someone else might have to action that transaction after the rollback. And, you don't really have control of your money at that point, but you do have access to these deep liquidity on-chain liquidity networks, and that kind of makes up for it. Like, I worry that there is just no more line in the sand to be drawn, and that, we do just kind of gravitate towards these World War III resistant chains as, the fail safe for us to use while we play on these quote unquote sandboxes that just let us do what we want in terms of what the regulations dictate. I just worry about this world, because the line then between fintech and crypto is completely non-existent, and crypto is just pushed into this tiny little corner over here. How are you thinking about all of that?
Yeah, I worry about these things too, actually. And for me, one of the core affordances of crypto is permissionlessness. And that decentralization is a kind of prerequisite for that. So if you let go of that, which Tempo have, then you're going to have to do rollbacks. You're not going to be able to let large hacks go down that may end up in extremely dodgy hands. And you're not going to be able to, if you can credibly stop the network and roll it back at will, then you'll have to. So, and in fact, I'm very sure, being a stablecoin sort of orientated thing and partnering with Stripe, they're going to do chargebacks, and they'll do reversible transactions, and they'll move in, which is a credible future dimension of the way that crypto could go in. And you're right, that will become kind of fintech 2.0, if you like. And that's going to be a huge industry. But in my mind, it won't be crypto. It will be kind of just neo fintech And you could probably, in the past, I've referred to this kind of fork in the road as kind of Web3 in crypto. Web3 being this kind of much more permission centralized, kind of socially orientated environment that's much more user friendly, but lets go of things like decentralization and permissionlessness. But certainly, as a kind of core value set in the likes of Solana, permissionlessness is a key and core direction that the network is going to maintain. And I think that's going to be the line in the sand. And in fact, what's likely to happen, I think, is as these kind of regulations firm up, we're going to start to see different carve-outs, certainly the likes of Mica that has emerged, that has come out, and Mica 2 is starting to define this line of decentralization. And if you're credibly decentralized, then you will have a different sort of regulatory and compliance framework that you'll move into. So I think we're just going to start to see more clear and obvious separation between these classes of networks. And I think you sort of touched on this earlier, but I see the kind of broader industry now as a kind of tapestry of these different interconnected blockchains, each with their own utility cases and trade-offs that they've taken. And it's actually good that we've got these kind of different, we're starting to see these instead of all of these kind of general purpose blockchains that are, what's the difference between them? A slightly different consensus mechanism or whatever, but how does it materially change? I think we're going to start to see those separations around which philosophy these networks are picking. And I do think true crypto is likely to be the ones that maintain the most value in their assets. Tempo, for example, might have the most stablecoin volume flowing through it, but its currency itself won't, if it does one even, will not generate as much value as the like of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana because they are credibly neutral, permissionless, and decentralized.
I hope so, because then at least the market valuations do make sense from an idealistic point of view. That the reason that we are building all of these things is to be credibly neutral and decentralized. So the market should value that. Yeah, I don't know. Like I don't know if the more fintechy networks and their coins, because I mean, where my brain immediately goes is the divide between Linux and Microsoft and Apple, and Microsoft and Apple are the some of the most valuable companies in the world, but there's not a Linux in the top 10 or top 20, you'd say, so it's like I want to believe that. I just wonder if the market is too nihilistic to really agree, but at least they do for now. The thesis is sound for now, and yeah, I suppose I hope that your version of the future actually does become more real as we go on.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think we're close to kind of peak financial nihilism as it is right now. I'd be wondering where that goes if it goes even further. But sure. So even in that context, right, decentralization has some degree of a premium. I think BNB is a bit of an outlier there. That has, there's, and I think that's because it's got this deep adjacency with Binance and there's a degree of control over that network that allows it to capture that much value, and it's got the kind of whole Asian market to target. But I do think we will end up with a kind of battleground for decentralization, and the likes of permissionlessness will be challenged as there's probably a good amount of powerful actors that wish there wasn't permissionless blockchains that kind of facilitate people to trade on them and transact on them that they would wish they could stop, right? So I do think, although we're in a rather amenable regulatory environment at the moment because of the kind of shift in policy context in America, I do anticipate that will change again in the future. And decentralization and these networks are a kind of challenge to centralized forms of power because they cannot be controlled in quite the same way. So I think we will always have this like section of the industry that is like protects these affordances because that level of long-term thinking is very obviously needed.
Yeah, just to bring it back to the original kind of my monologue. It's that we haven't really spoken about how much the most used chain is even factored into all of this. So it's like we almost need some kind of legitimate metric for decentralization, but I mean, even all of the regulators in the US and around the world haven't figured out how to do that either. There's like the Nakamoto coefficient, or like, how do you look at, I know permissionlessness might be the overarching thing, and that's not really a metric, that's more of a property. How do you view measuring decentralization then?
There's a few ways to think about this. It's easier to think about when you know you haven't got it. So for me, I think about this from the lens of DAOs, right, where you've got this kind of interplay between decentralization, autonomy, and organization. And for me, decentralization collapses when the system thinks like a single mind, when effectively there is a single personal group that controls the thing, in which case they can make unilateral decisions around the network. Articulating it, the Nakamoto coefficient is kind of not a great measure. It presumes that all of the validators will collude against the network. It presumes a kind of perfect collusion. So that's not quite a great network either. Like, number of validators, to some degree, could be a kind of vanity metric, where over a certain threshold, it kind of doesn't matter as much. I do think the kind of things like Ethereum protecting solo staking is really important, and that's Vitalik's red line. But the number of solo stakers you have, it just needs to be possible. And in fact, if you look at the decentralization of the Ethereum network and where it's distributed across the world, it's almost exactly the same as Solana. And most Ethereum validators live inside data centers, just like they do in Solana. So I think like decentralization is a kind of elusive concept in that sense. And when you've lost your autonomy, which is a kind of function of decentralization, when you've been captured effectively. Once the network can and has been taken over, it's kind of collapsed.